The mansion sat alone on a hill, its weathered stone walls whispering secrets to the wind that swept through the overgrown trees. The land around it was untouched by time, silent, still, as if the world had forgotten it. The air was thick with decay, and the faint smell of mildew lingered like a ghost, clinging to everything it touched. Inside, the family had lived for generations, isolated from the rest of the world. The estate was home to the Elridge family, a name long forgotten by all but the most local of villagers. Their presence was known, yet never acknowledged. The mansion had once been a grand symbol of wealth, but now it was a crumbling relic, its grandeur lost to the passage of time. The family had their own way of life, one that was peculiar, almost ritualistic in nature. They were not seen, not heard, yet they persisted. A tradition ran deep through their bloodline, one that had been practiced for as long as anyone could remember. A tradition too disturbing for outsiders to even fathom. In the dusty corners of the mansion, portraits of generations long gone hung on the walls. Their faces were stern, their eyes hollow with secrets that never left their gaze. The family lived in isolation, their silence louder than any voice. They kept to themselves, never straying from the path that had been laid before them, never questioning the tradition they had inherited. The eldest son, William, was the heir to the estate, but his mind had been shaped by the generations before him, raised in a world where secrecy was paramount, where every gesture had a purpose, and every word carried weight. He was groomed to uphold the family's most sacred duty. But what was that duty? The tradition had been passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, and was whispered between the walls of the mansion. The details were never spoken aloud, but they were understood by all. The family's way was different, hidden beneath layers of normalcy, waiting for the next generation to carry it forward. And so, when William married his daughter, the eldest of the next generation, it was not out of love, but necessity. It was tradition. He could not and would not break the chain that had been forged so many years ago. The walls of the mansion, steeped in secrets, seemed to close in on them as the cycle continued. But even in a house where no words were spoken, where no questions were asked, there was something wrong. And as time went on, the first cracks began to appear. The silence of the mansion was no longer peaceful. It was suffocating. Something dark was taking root. The mansion's silence was broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or the distant howl of wind against the decaying stone. The family had long since stopped interacting with the outside world, their existence confined to the walls that housed their grotesque secrets. But as the years passed, things began to change in the house, subtle shifts that no one could explain. William's daughter, Elizabeth, was the first to notice something was wrong. She had always been an obedient daughter, raised to understand the significance of the family's ways. But as she grew older, the consequences of her family's traditions became harder to ignore. Her body was betraying her, twisting in ways that no one had prepared her for. The once beautiful features of her face had become distorted, her skin pale and splotched, her eyes sunken into her skull. At first, Elizabeth had tried to hide it. She covered her face with layers of makeup and avoided looking into mirrors. She tried to convince herself that the changes were nothing more than a temporary affliction. But as the months went on, the transformation was undeniable. William, too, was changing. His once imposing figure had begun to wither. The years of inbreeding had caught up with him, and his mind, once sharp and commanding, was beginning to unravel. The weight of the family's tradition had taken its toll, eroding his mental stability. At times, he would speak to his daughter as though she were someone else, and his movements had become erratic, as though the very air in the mansion was pressing down on him. The family's dysfunction was beginning to surface in other ways as well. Strange events started happening around the mansion, lights flickering, doors creaking open by themselves, and objects falling from shelves without explanation. The family members attributed it to the house settling or the wind's influence. But deep down, they all knew it was something more. Something was wrong. The mansion, once a symbol of power and tradition, now felt like a tomb. As Elizabeth's condition worsened, she began to question the silence that had governed her life. She had always been taught to obey, to never question. But now she could no longer ignore the truth that was unfolding before her. The inbreeding, the twisted cycles, and the strange behaviors were all the result of a dark and twisted tradition. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that the family's isolation wasn't just physical, it was mental, psychological. They had been trapped in this endless cycle, bound by blood, with no way out. One evening, as Elizabeth sat alone in her room, she stumbled upon an old journal hidden beneath the floorboards. The leather-bound book was brittle, yellowed with age, and the pages inside were covered in spidery handwriting. It was a diary from one of her ancestors, her great-grandmother. Elizabeth's hands trembled as she opened it, and her eyes scanned the words, each one more horrifying than the last. The journal detailed the family's first foray into inbreeding, the justification for it, and the twisted beliefs that had been passed down through the generations. It spoke of a need to preserve the bloodline, to keep the family pure by preventing outside blood from entering the fold. It described the horror of incest, how it was seen not as a crime, but as a sacred duty, a way to keep the family's legacy alive. Elizabeth's stomach turned as she read the pages, the truth sinking in. She had always known there was something off about the family, but this was beyond comprehension. The journal detailed the relationships between fathers and daughters, mothers and sons, generations of this horrifying cycle. With no escape, each child born from these unions bore the mark of their ancestors' twisted minds, deformed bodies, and a legacy of madness. But even more disturbing was the final entry. It described how the family's tradition had reached its ultimate culmination with William and Elizabeth, the latest generation. The journal hinted that Elizabeth herself had been the product of this unholy union, a product of years of genetic corruption. It was then that she realized the twisted legacy was not just something she had inherited, it was something she had become. The realization hit Elizabeth with the force of a hammer. She wasn't just trapped in the mansion, she was trapped in her own bloodline, a bloodline that had been tainted for centuries. As the night fell and the wind howled outside, Elizabeth knew that she could never escape the horror of her family's past. She was bound to it, chained by the sins of those who came before her. And though she tried to ignore it, the truth loomed large in her mind. The cycle would continue, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. The mansion felt different now, heavier, as though it carried the weight of centuries of secrets hidden within its walls. Elizabeth could no longer ignore the reality that had been staring her in the face, the journal revealing truths she had never wished to know. As days passed, the isolation grew more suffocating, the silence more deafening, as if the very air around her was pressing in. The family had always been a silent, self-contained unit, but now, the weight of the unspoken truths seemed to suffocate them. Her father, William, was no longer the imposing figure he once was. His health had deteriorated rapidly, his once powerful frame now hunched and frail. His eyes, once sharp and focused, were now dull and clouded with confusion. At times, he would mutter incoherently, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there, his words making no sense to anyone listening. The madness that had gripped him was becoming undeniable. The family had always been trained to maintain the facade of normalcy, to hide the true nature of their existence from outsiders. But now, the cracks were showing. The eerie events that had once been dismissed as mere coincidence, objects moving on their own, whispers in the halls, the unsettling feeling of being watched had become too frequent to ignore. It was as if the house itself was alive, reacting to the weight of the dark secret that had been buried for so long. One evening, as Elizabeth wandered the mansion in a daze, lost in the labyrinth of rooms, she stumbled upon a hidden door, one she had never noticed before. It was tucked away behind a thick tapestry, its wooden frame darkened with age. The door creaked open with an unsettling groan, revealing a narrow staircase that led down into the bowels of the mansion, into the very heart of the house, driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity. Elizabeth descended the stairs, the air growing colder as she moved deeper into the mansion's forgotten underbelly. The walls were lined with old, dusty shelves filled with forgotten relics, their surfaces caked with the residue of years of neglect. At the bottom of the staircase, Elizabeth found a small, dimly lit room. It was unlike any other room in the house. Its walls were lined with shelves, but they were filled not with books, but with jars. Each jar contained something strange, something horrifying. Preserved specimens, grotesque and malformed, floated in formaldehyde. There were deformed limbs, twisted faces, and other body parts, all carefully labeled with dates and names. Some of the jars contained entire bodies, their skins stretched thin and pallid, their eyes wide open in eternal, silent screams. Elizabeth's stomach churned as she realized the true extent of her family's depravity. These were not just records of inbreeding, they were trophies, evidence of the family's twisted history. The jars contained the remnants of generations of family members, their bodies preserved as if to prove the success or failure of the family's horrifying tradition. This was the price of their secrecy, the cost of maintaining their bloodline. But there, on one of the shelves, was something that caught Elizabeth's eye, a jar labeled with her name. The label was old and faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable. She opened the jar with trembling hands and gasped. Inside, there was a small, deformed fetus. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea crashing over her, but as she stared at it, the full weight of her family's history hit her like a physical blow. Her father, William, had known about this. He had known what his family had done, what they had created, and he had continued the tradition without question. And now, Elizabeth realized, she was the product of that twisted legacy. She had been born into a cycle of madness, and there was no way out. The horrors she had witnessed in the mansion were only the beginning. As she stumbled back up the stairs, her heart pounding in her chest, Elizabeth could feel the walls closing in on her. The mansion, once a symbol of power and tradition, had become a prison, a tomb for a family doomed by their own actions. There was no escape, no redemption. The truth had been revealed, and it was worse than she could have ever imagined. William, meanwhile, had become aware of the fact that his daughter had discovered the family's darkest secret. His mind, already unraveling, had begun to show signs of panic. The house, too, seemed to react to the revelation. The creaking floorboards grew louder, the whispers in the walls more insistent, as if the mansion itself was alive with fear. Elizabeth returned to her room, her mind racing, trying to comprehend the enormity of what she had uncovered. The mansion seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though it had come alive in response to the secret that had been exposed. But no matter how much she tried to push it out of her mind, the truth remained. She was bound to this place, bound to this legacy of horror. The mansion, once a grand symbol of wealth and power, was now a decaying monument to the madness of the Elridge family. Each passing day seemed to chip away at the very foundation of the house, as if the building itself was crumbling under the weight of the dark secret that had been unearthed. Elizabeth could feel it, the sense of impending doom that permeated every room, every hallway. The house, once silent and still, now seemed to echo with the whispers of the past, of things best left forgotten. Her father, William, had grown worse. The madness that had plagued him for years had taken full control. His once proud frame now trembled, and his eyes, once sharp and commanding, had become empty, lifeless. He no longer spoke in coherent sentences. His thoughts were jumbled, a constant stream of half-formed ideas and fragmented memories. Sometimes, he would mutter to himself, speaking in the voices of his ancestors as if they were still with him, still guiding him in his deranged actions. The walls of the mansion felt like they were closing in on them, the air growing thick with an unshakable sense of fear. The family's secrets, once buried deep, had now begun to suffocate them. And as Elizabeth wandered through the decaying halls, she saw the changes in the others, her relatives. The few who still lived in the mansion with her, her younger brother, Samuel, had once been a bright, inquisitive child, but now he was a shadow of his former self. His body was twisted, malformed, and his mind had retreated into a haze of paranoia. He rarely left his room now, his eyes wide with terror at every creak and groan of the mansion. It was clear that the inbreeding had not just affected their physical appearance, but had left scars on their minds as well. The family's isolation, their adherence to the twisted traditions, had created monsters out of once innocent souls. One evening, as Elizabeth sat alone in her room, she heard a knock at the door. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, her mind playing tricks on her after the horror she had uncovered. But when she opened the door, she found nothing. The hallway was empty, the shadows deep and endless. Yet, she could feel something lurking just beyond the corner of her vision. As she stepped into the hallway, the air seemed to shift, growing colder. The faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deep within the mansion, footsteps that were not her own. Elizabeth's heart raced as she turned a corner, and there, in the darkness, she saw him, her father, William, standing at the end of the hallway. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, his body trembling. "Father," Elizabeth called out, her voice barely above a whisper. William didn't respond. Instead, he slowly lifted his hand, pointing towards something in the distance. Elizabeth's gaze followed his finger, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a figure standing in the shadows, someone or something watching them. But when she blinked, the figure was gone. The mansion had become more than just a place of decay. It was now a labyrinth of madness, each corner hiding more horrors than the last. Elizabeth felt trapped, not just in the house, but in the very bloodline she was born into. There was no escape. The mansion, with its hidden rooms and dark corners, seemed to be alive, a manifestation of the family's dark history. The fear that had been building inside Elizabeth reached its peak that night. She could no longer deny it. The truth had shattered everything she had known. Her family's tradition, once shrouded in secrecy, was now laid bare for all to see. But the horror didn't end with the revelation. It had only just begun. The following days were a blur of confusion and terror. William's condition worsened, his behavior becoming more erratic by the hour. He would often wander the mansion, calling out to voices that only he could hear. He spoke of things long dead, of ancestors who were not truly gone, but merely waiting for their return. Elizabeth tried to reason with him, but he was beyond reason now. The mansion, it seemed, had claimed him entirely. As for Samuel, his behavior grew even more disturbing. He became increasingly violent, his mind unraveling faster than Elizabeth could keep up. It was clear that the family had passed the point of no return. Their isolation, their twisted traditions, had pushed them beyond the brink. The mansion was no longer a home. It was a prison, one that had ensnared them all. And then, one night, as the storm outside raged, Elizabeth heard something she would never forget: the sound of footsteps, deliberate and slow, echoing down the hall towards her room. She knew, deep in her soul, that whatever it was no longer human. It was something far darker, far older. The family's downfall was inevitable. There was no escaping the curse that had been passed down through generations. The bloodline was doomed, and so too was the mansion that had witnessed its darkest deeds. The storm raged outside, its furious winds howling as they battered against the crumbling mansion. The trees that surrounded the estate swayed violently, their branches clawing at the windows, as if trying to tear the house apart. The air inside was thick with an oppressive sense of dread, a feeling that had become all too familiar in the days leading up to this moment. Elizabeth, now alone in the mansion with her deteriorating family, could feel the weight of the past closing in on her. There was no escape, no way out. The mansion had become a tomb, and she was trapped inside. For days, she had heard the footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing through the halls, growing louder with each passing hour. She could no longer ignore them. Whatever it was, whoever it was coming for her. The mansion itself seemed to hum with a malevolent energy, as though it were aware of the final act that was about to unfold. Elizabeth had spent the night wandering the halls, her heart racing as the madness inside her family deepened. William had all but lost his sanity, his eyes vacant, his movements jerky and erratic. Samuel had become a shell of the person he once was, his body twisted and contorted, his mind shattered by the curse that had haunted their bloodline. The mansion seemed to have consumed them all, each one becoming a part of the house's twisted legacy. And now, Elizabeth could feel herself slipping too. The sickness, the same sickness that had consumed her father and brother, had started to take hold of her. Her body had changed, deformed in subtle ways that were impossible to ignore. The air felt thick with the scent of decay, the walls pressing in on her, suffocating her with their unspoken history. As she reached the old library, the one place in the mansion that had always been a refuge, she heard it again, the footsteps, closer now. Her breath caught in her throat, and she turned towards the darkened hallway, her eyes wide with terror. There, at the end of the corridor, stood a figure, a silhouette, tall and imposing. Elizabeth's heart pounded in her chest as she recognized the figure, her father. But it wasn't William as she had known him. This was something else. His face was twisted, his eyes black pits of nothingness, his body hunched and contorted in unnatural ways. "Father," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to move toward her, its steps slow but deliberate, its presence suffocating. Elizabeth's legs felt weak beneath her, and she stumbled back, her body trembling in terror. The figure continued to advance, its steps echoing in the silence of the mansion. As the figure neared, Elizabeth saw something that made her blood run cold. On the ground at its feet lay the lifeless body of Samuel. His face was twisted in a grotesque expression of horror, his eyes wide open, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. The figure stepped over his body without a second glance, its eyes locked on Elizabeth. In that moment, Elizabeth understood. The curse that had plagued their family for generations had finally come full circle. She was not just the product of the family's inbreeding, she was its final victim. The mansion had claimed her, as it had claimed them all. There was no escape from the bloodline, no escape from the horrors of the past. With a final, shuddering breath, Elizabeth fell to her knees, her body racked with convulsions as the sickness took hold of her. The mansion seemed to close in on her, its walls pressing against her as though it were trying to consume her. The figure, her father, or whatever he had become, loomed over her, its hollow eyes staring down at her with a malevolent intensity. The last thing Elizabeth saw before the darkness claimed her was the twisted face of her father, a smile creeping across his lips, as though he had finally completed the cycle that had begun so long ago, with a family bound by blood, by a tradition that had cursed them all. And then there was silence. The mansion stood still, the storm outside quieting as if the world had forgotten the horrors that had unfolded within those walls. The echoes of footsteps faded into the distance, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The mansion stood, untouched by time, its crumbling walls a silent testament to the family that had once lived within. The windows were shattered, the doors broken, but still, it remained silent, cold, and empty. The Elridge family was gone, their legacy buried beneath layers of decay and neglect. But the mansion endured, its secrets still hidden within the walls, waiting for the next soul to stumble upon them. The bloodline, though extinguished, had left its mark on the land, its influence still lingering in the shadows. No one would speak of the horrors that had transpired within those walls. No one would remember the family that had once been consumed by their own twisted tradition. And as the wind howled through the trees, the mansion stood as a warning, a reminder of the darkness that can fester in the silence, the horrors that can be born from the secrets we keep.